Welcome to Epilogue, where I tell you folk tales and legends, then fabricate my own counterpart from those root yarns. I am that house at the top of your street that no one lives in, save the strange shadow in the dark attic window. But you can call me Izzie Cava. America is rich in ghost towns, settlements whose ambitions were to become the next Boston or New York, but are now little more than rubble and stone, if they were even found at all. Dudleytown is one such settlement in the northwest of Connecticut's Cornwall Township. The land was acquired by a man named Thomas Griffiths in the early 1740s, then sold to Gideon Dudley in 1747, where Gideon and his brothers Abiel and Barzali settled down and named the town after themselves. The town itself resides in a valley of the dark entry forest, overshadowed by the Bald and Coltsfoot Mountains. The town was doomed from the start due to its lack of clean drinking water and poor soil quality. The site had been a Native American burial ground for the Mohawk tribe, which was thoroughly disrespected by the colonists and thought to contribute to the town's eventual fate. But there was also said to be a curse that emigrated with the Dudley family. In 1510, a man named Edmund Dudley was beheaded for plotting to overthrow King Henry VIII. His son, John Dudley, attempted much the opposite and was betrothed to Lady Jane Grey, who was queen for a very short time before her own beheading. Supposedly a curse was placed on the family then, that took root in Dudleytown's infertile soil and blossomed into madness. Dudleytown's brief history is laced with raving lunatics, strange disappearances, and a number of suicides. One of Gideon's brothers, Abiel Dudley, lost everything: his savings, his house, and his mind. The town reclaimed and sold his house to Nathaniel Carter when Abiel was unable to pay his debts, and Abiel died at 90, a ward of the state. Carter and his family lived in Abiel's house for some time, but when Carter left to build a log cabin in upstate New York, he came back to a house that was burned to the ground, his wife and child dead inside of it. He joined them shortly after. The next untimely death befell Gershon Holster in 1792, when he fell through William Tanner's roof while he was attempting to mend it. Tanner's house was right beside Abiel's, and much like Abiel, he lost his mind after Gershon's death, claiming there were wild animals in the forest, waiting to get them, and evil spirits who had sent them. There were a number of other deaths as the town attempted to establish itself in the 19th century. Sarah Fay was struck by lightning in 1804. Her husband, Herman Swift, was a famed general who had survived the horrors of the Revolutionary War, but lost his mind after he lost his wife. Mary Cheney committed suicide in her Dudleytown residence around 70 years later. Her husband, presidential nominee Horace Greeley, went on to lose the 18th presidential election to Ulysses S. Grant. Throughout Dudleytown's tragic history, there were reports of people claiming to have seen apparitions in the woods, demonic creatures from another world, at home in the dark entry forest. It was also said that anyone who saw those creatures would wander into the forest and join them shortly after. One of the last remaining residents, John Patrick Brophy, may have met them. He may have even brought them into his house. In 1901, his wife died of consumption, and after the funeral his children disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. Then his house burned down from a fire seemingly without cause, and he joined his children in their woodland exile. Was the Dudley curse powerful enough to ruin those households? Were the restless spirits of the desecrated burial ground taking their revenge? Or perhaps there was something in the woods, something that did not want to be seen by mortal eyes. But perhaps not, for Connecticut resident and Dudley descendant Reverend Gary P. debunked the majority of the happenings in Dudleytown, starting with the Dudleys having no relation to the English family that participated in King Henry's beheading. John Dudley's sons died young or immigrated to Italy, so they could not be Gideon's ancestors. Abiel Dudley did not go mad. He was an old man who went senile. The Carter tragedy was real, but it happened miles away from Dudleytown, and his children survived, one of them even growing up to be a Supreme Court justice. General Herman Swift and Mary Cheney never resided in Dudleytown. Both grew old and died naturally. Dudleytown was abandoned by all save a couple of squatters, but even they are now gone from the land. All that remains is the foundations of the houses that are slowly being consumed by the woods they were carved out of. Those who visit the site say they feel an intense wave of sadness, or something far more oppressive, like suffocation from unseen forces. Ed and Lorraine Warren, self-styled demonologists whose work on Rhode Island's Amityville Horror inspired The Conjuring and subsequent films, videotaped a Halloween special from Dudleytown in the 1970s, but they were some of the last allowed in that spot. The Dark Entry Forest Association forbids anyone from trespassing on the site, as the forest is closed while they attempt to regrow much of the timber that was hewn by the settlers. The last Dudleytown resident to note is related to one of the founders of the Dark Entry Forest Association, Dr. William Clark. Dr. Clark was called away on a business trip one weekend to New York City, and when he returned, his wife was distressed to the point of insanity, claiming that there were strange creatures in the woods. She spent the rest of her life in an insane asylum, never to return to that strange forest full of dark secrets. And now for our epilogue. Christopher Marshall had spent his life on the outskirts of New York City, in a Connecticut neighborhood that did not have houses with less than 5 bedrooms. From the moment he graduated high school, he'd either been working towards a wildly successful career in corporate law, or he'd been engaging in corporate law for New York's greatest and greediest corporations. He spent the better part of his life collecting and discarding wives and cars. Soon enough, all that slowed as his retirement crept nearer, and with his 5th and final divorce happening on his 68th birthday, he packed up his life in the legal sector and bought a cabin in Vermont's Green Mountains, where he could hunt and fish to his heart's content. The cabin was not as grand as his other properties had been, but it was nice, and it was quiet. Each morning he woke to the sounds of bird calls ringing through the forest. He made himself a nice breakfast, then went out hunting. He was largely successful each time, catching rather large stags and does seemingly unawares. He shot ducks and geese out of the air and turkeys on the ground. He was not, by any means, the sharpest shooter in the woods, but the forest provided for him. On days when he chose to fish instead of hunt, he found himself equally rich in salmon and trout. In spite of his hobbies, Christopher considered himself to be something of an animal lover, and he enjoyed watching the birds fly above him and the squirrels scurry across his path. Then when the sun sank below the mountainous horizon, he enjoyed the bats that replaced the birds and the fireflies that always seemed to guide him back home. He loved that forest. It was an old forest, and a tall forest, full of beautiful trees and crawling vines. But every so often he heard noises he couldn't place. They were musical, but they weren't birdsong, and they did not come from above him, but rather beside him, as if something was walking with him. He got the sense that he was being watched, even when he was all alone. He saw strange tracks that had the qualities of both paw prints and bird feet in one monstrous step. He flipped through the books he had bought to identify the birds and beasts around him, but he could not place those tracks. Besides, when he went back to look for them later, they were always gone. So too were the bones and scraps of the animals he cleaned and cooked for himself from the many successful hunts. At first it was as if the raccoons and other pests had broken into his garbage bin, but once he started leaving the animal remains out to be taken, his bins were undisturbed and all traces of his kills were gone the next morning. But there's a certain phrase about too much of a good thing. In spite of the peace he had at the cabin, Christopher was lonely. He considered buying a hunting dog, but had several family pets pass away during his time in the Connecticut suburbs, and was no longer eager to grieve another cherished companion. Besides, in spite of the loneliness, he never felt truly alone in those woods. There was a little town about 10 miles out where Christopher went to purchase groceries and post his letters, and next to the little town hall there was a bar. It was nothing special, certainly nothing clean, but it was cozy and inviting, much like the locals therein. The beer was cheap, and the company of other hunters, fathers, and mavens of the quiet life was enough for him, and he made a weekly pilgrimage to the bar for conversation. Almost every patron was a regular, but there was always one who caught Christopher's eye, a man named Tucker Slim, who always wore a cowboy hat and bandana around his neck, no matter the weather. He wore a bullet on a silver chain, and each finger had a ring with a different stone. He looked like he might have been a rock star that had fallen on hard times, or a package store clerk with delusions of grandeur. The latter being more likely, Christopher steered clear of Tucker Slim, noting that some of the other regulars would shudder when he entered the bar, or else leave altogether. One night, right around the time Christopher decided he should be leaving, Tucker Slim sidled up to him and bought him a beer. Then another. Soon enough, they were the last two in the bar, and they'd been talking long into the night. Christopher's apprehension of Tucker melted away, and every time he would go to the bar, Tucker Slim would buy him a beer. After a few weeks, Christopher invited Tucker up to his cabin for dinner, seeing as he had enough veal to feed a small village. The moment Tucker stepped out of his pickup truck in Christopher's dirt driveway, his eyes were on the sprawling canopy above them. Dinner was lovely, but all the while Christopher could feel Tucker's eyes fixed on the window, on the beautiful forest behind him. Over whiskeys on the porch, Tucker asked Christopher if he'd ever considered selling off any of the lumber on his property. Christopher told him that he hadn't, and besides, the thought of finding labor and distribution was too much of a headache. Tucker's eyes lit up, for that was his business. He would organize everything, see to it that Christopher got a cut, and take the trees far away from the cabin so as not to create any aesthetic displeasure. Christopher still felt this was encroaching on the peace he had grown accustomed to in his sylvan paradise. But Tucker had done this before, and the sums he promised for as little effort as he offered were tantalizing to a man who had almost never known a day without income. Tucker convinced him that the enterprise would be easy enough, so Tucker drew up a contract and brought it to the bar. Now Christopher had spent his life looking for contracts that sought to exploit the signee. He'd even spent his most profitable cases drafting contracts that did just that. But by all accounts the contract suited him fine, so he signed it. The very next day, Tucker brought his crews and his machines into the woods and got to work. At the end of the week, they'd sold enough lumber at such high prices they could afford twice the laborers and even nicer machines. Obviously the animals avoided the racket, but try as he might, not one deer crossed his path. For days he was out in the woods, and came home with a gun that had the same number of bullets it had when he set out. He had no luck in the river, even though they were in the season where salmon were swimming upstream. At breakfast he noted that the dish slid a few inches to the right when he put it on the table. Then he noticed everything was slightly to the right of where it should have been. He went out and observed his cabin was starting to sink into the earth, and took great pains to nail down his furniture and reinforce the foundations to the best of his ability. The next day, the cabin had sunk even lower. When he went on his walks in the evening, he noted that the birdsong was sparse and shrill, less of a chorus, more of a warning. If there was a firefly, it would be dim and sickly, going out before his eyes. Even though he'd walked the path 100 times, Christopher got lost on his way home, taking hours to return to his cabin, and somehow always passing by the bald spot where Tucker had cleared the trees. Whatever was watching him seemed closer now, meaner now, hunting him instead of observing him. The weeks wore on without a single kill. Christopher stopped taking walks. In spite of the distance from his cabin, Christopher could hear their saws and blades as though they were felling the trees in his back garden. It occurred to him how much better his life had been before he'd gone into business with Tucker Slim, so he called Tucker up and asked him to end their operation. It had been a good run, they'd made a good buck, but it was over now. Tucker laughed, then reminded him that they'd signed a contract. Tucker was bound to this land every bit as much as Chris was. Then it was Christopher's turn to laugh. He'd spent his life coming up against the intellectual prowess of far superior men. He never would have signed a contract if he didn't see a way out of it. Christopher caught Tucker on the ambiguous wording of some of the stipulations. Tucker wasn't a lawyer, after all. He could never have guessed at their tricks. And the lumber business was dissolved. Tucker refused to take his big ugly machines off Christopher's property, but a few phone calls to the police took care of that for him. As far as Christopher was concerned, their business was over. The forest seemed to agree, for his hunting regained momentum. In fact, the spoils doubled, as if he was being rewarded for ridding the land of the pestilence of Tucker Slim. His house seemed to right itself all on its own. It may have even stood taller than before. The barren patch left over from the doomed enterprise was smaller every time Christopher would pass it, but it never went away entirely. There was always a collection of stumps where the machines had been, a reminder not to make the same mistake twice. But again he felt the tug of loneliness at the edges of his heart, so he returned to the bar and conversed with those same friendly locals who had been so kind to him all those months before. Tucker was scarce, but talk of him was not. When Christopher told them what had happened, none were surprised by how the events played out. Many of them had gone into business with Tucker Slim themselves, but they were not so lucky with their contracts. Christopher had offered to help them, inviting them to his cabin when they needed it. On hearing the address, some of the locals pricked up their ears. Tucker had his sights on that property for years. He'd even tried to buy the cabin before Christopher had closed the deal. There was talk, mostly just rumor, that back in the day Tucker Slim had taken the girl who lived there to prom. Afterwards, they were fooling around in the woods, and Tucker claimed he saw something evil in those trees, something vile and abominable, some kind of beast that should not even exist on the edge of society. Tucker was written off as scapegoating imaginary demons for the loss of his prom date to a better man, but he told tales that had been repeated in myth throughout the wider world. Most of the spirits in the forest are trickster gods, like the Leshy from Slavic folklore, known to shapeshift. Its game was leading people to the center of the woods, then abandoning them with a laugh, similar to the Curupia of Brazilian myth. This little trickster was a protector of the forest, known for having backwards feet to lead whoever might be tracking it in the wrong direction. There are far more banal spirits in other forests, beautiful women who are the spirits of the trees, such as the Dryads for the ancient Greeks and the Huldra for the ancient Norsemen. The woodwives of Germanic folklore were another kind of forested maiden. They would ask for gifts from those on the forest edge in exchange for gold, but if ever the recipient revealed where they came by the coins, they would become nothing more than wood chips. Moss folk were similar to the woodwives, but they were small grey dwarves who would tend to wounded animals and guide healers to the right herbs, as were the Waldgeister, the eldest of which being the Holdimur, or Elder Mother, who protected the oldest trees in the forest. There were terrible consequences for encroaching on her realm, just like there was if you did not seek the permission of the forest god Tapoyo when hunting in Finland. The Hakuturi were the Maori guardians of the forest, and the Japanese Kodama were ancient tree spirits who would bless kindly souls with good fortune, or curse those who dared disturb their forest. But that was all long ago in places far away, and Christopher never cared much for legends. He thanked his friends at the bar and drove back to his cabin. As he turned the bend, he saw that all the trees surrounding his cabin had not just been cut down, they'd been hacked down by the cruelest vandals. Some of the wood was gone, probably to be sold to Tucker Slim's various connections, but some of the trees were simply shredded and left to rot among the leaves they had shed. Christopher was not an overly emotional man, but there was something about that massacre. It was almost as if he could feel the tree's pain, as if he'd stumbled onto a battlefield and had to wade through corpses to reach his front door. He cried and cried, in the dark, among the ruins of his perfect paradise. Then he heard a crack, like a mighty branch falling, and through his tears he saw the trees stand up again. The ones that were taken were lost, leaving tall stumps with jagged ends biting into the night sky. The rest bore marks of their torture, gashes through their beautiful bark and flowers with shredded petals. He heard another mighty fall from somewhere beside him, and turned. Then he ran, deep into the woods, ran until the fireflies surrounded him and he realized he was lost, and whatever had been following him all this time was before him. It was about 13 feet tall. Its skin was laced with green veins, like a leaf in the springtime. It had fashioned clothing for itself out of moss and twigs, and its most brutal features were carved from rough stone. It had been the thing making those tracks, as it had paws on the bottom of its talons. On its head it wore a great crown of thorns and ivy, and when it looked down on Christopher, its eyes glittered with a light that had not been seen by any man in many hundreds of years. Its voice was deep, like a strong wind through old boughs, and it spoke without asking questions, but always passing judgment. You have brought a monster to the heart of the forest. He's gone now. I sent him away. He came back. That had nothing to do with me. He committed a crime. I will see to it that he is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Your law. Yes. We were kind to you. And all the fireflies went out. All Christopher could see was that terrible light in its eyes. And you brought him here. Please do not punish me for his crimes. I'll do anything to keep him out, I swear. We can make a deal, a contract. I'll honor it forever. No contracts. We deal in promises. I can't promise he won't be back. He's crafty, he knows his way around. Then the promise will be ours. Give him to us. How? Bring him back. I don't understand. Then don't. You want him to come back? We want justice. Promise us that we will have it. The clouds broke, and pale moonlight made the clearing silver. In the darkness, the creature had grown taller. It was 20 feet at least. It towered over Christopher, but it was not menacing. It was only curious. So Christopher nodded. I promise. When he woke, he hardly remembered that anything had happened at all. save for those trees whose stumps were tall and jagged outside his front door. He made his breakfast and took a long look out the window, and he could have sworn he saw those bright eyes watching him from somewhere among the foliage. Even if it had been a dream, he'd made a promise. So he called Tucker Slim and told him he was sorry. He told him to come back and bring his axe. They would get a day of work done themselves before calling in the crew tomorrow. It took half the time it should have for Tucker to drive up to Christopher's front door. When he saw the trees were not felled and Christopher was not angry, Tucker Slim decided he'd gotten away with it, not to ask any questions. He followed Christopher deep into the woods, talk of profit and expansion and partners and business on his lips all the while. Christopher was not listening to him. He was listening to the bird song, which faded until there was a single trill sounding above them. It was warning enough, and Christopher knew in that moment he'd kept his promise. "Why don't you start over there?" Christopher asked him, and went to stand beside the trunk of an elm tree. Tucker greedily found the largest and oldest tree on the path and raised his axe. It fell with a crack and a scream. What happened next was only ever described by Christopher once, and that was the last night he was ever seen in town. In the blink of an eye, the tree had grown around Tucker Slim. What was more was that Tucker Slim was in unfathomable pain. He could only scream one word through his agony, and that word was teeth. Christopher saw the beast behind him, and he could have sworn it winked its starlight eye. Then in the next second, Tucker was gone. So was the creature. Slowly, softly, afraid it might get him next, Christopher crept to the tree to see if there were any traces of Tucker Slim. And there were. Strands of his hair were woven between the cracks in the bark. Some of his teeth fell among the seeds and acorns. His fingernails grew out of the leaves, and the rock star outfit he wore rotted away to lichen on the branches. The creature was gone, but from all around him, Christopher heard it say, "It is done." Christopher put his cabin on the market that afternoon. He went to town less and less until he finally stopped leaving the forest at all. Potential buyers would come to his cabin, but something always went wrong. That day the foundation would slant, or the tires of their car would blow out on a particularly sharp tree root. Christopher's infrequent calls with his children dwindled to nothing, and not one of them came to check on him. If they had, they would have found that his real estate agent was dealing with a man whose sanity was slipping. All he did was hunt, fish, and talk to the forest. After a few years, his house was taken off the market. It faded from memory, and even those who accidentally found it on their hikes or hunts would have seen a cabin being overtaken by the woods. If they were there too long, then Christopher would greet them and guide them deeper into the woods. But he would never guide them out again. Some say he's still up there, haunting the Green Mountains, hand in hand with the spirits. Their voice, their envoy. If that's true, then Christopher is an ancient man by our standards. But as a member of the forest, his life has barely begun. That's the end of today's tale. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed telling it. Please remember to like, share, and tell all your friends. Join me next time for more fabricated folktales on Epilogue.